You're recording.
I'm recording.
And it's like you don't have to look at yourself. You can put that in the background. You can
still recording. Okay.
So it's like if you say anything, or if you think out loud, then it will start to capture it. That's all.
Okay. So I am Melanie Moon, and my son is helping me to record myself reading this book. It is entitled Race and the City. And I had to order it special. And I'd like to read the preface. Many people don't read the preface of the book, but it gives a good background for the reason that the book was written. I just picked it up today from the library, and I was excited to find it when I did, and excited that I was able to order it, and it came today. Cincinnati holds a distinctive place in the history of race relations and African Americans in the United States. It is part of the borderland, a border city in a border state, and sits astride the boundary between the North and South. This marginality was most pronounced during the antebellum era, when Cincinnati was a real dividing line between slavery and freedom, and the population was composed of large numbers of Southerners, including a black population consisting primarily of former slaves and aggressive abolitionists. In its early days, Cincinnati was a very racist city. After denying blacks the right to vote at its first constitutional convention in 1802, Ohio enacted in 1804 and 1807 a series of black laws to discourage black immigration and settlement in the state. These laws required blacks to register and post $500 bond, excluded them from jury service and from testifying in cases involving whites, barred them from participating in the militia, and denied them the benefits of the poor law and of institutions for the physically and mentally infirm. Although they paid taxes to support local schools, blacks were excluded from public schools, and no provisions were made for their education until 1829. Prejudice and discriminatory behavior kept many blacks from learning new skills and practicing the ones they already possessed. Although slavery was made illegal by the Northwest Ordinance, slaveholders visited Cincinnati so frequently and lived there so comfortably that no one even challenged their right to bring their peculiar property into the state. These attitudes and practices were reinforced by the many conservative white Southerners settling in Cincinnati. At the time, Northerners and liberal-minded Southerners moved to the city as well. As a result, antebellum Cincinnati became a hotbed of abolitionism, a major station on the Underground Railroad, and a battleground to determine if slaveholders would, in fact, be allowed to bring their slaves into the state. Yet, Cincinnati was not simply a northern city looking south. The city had a dual personality, a schizophrenic northern and southern personality occupying the same urban body. Across time, Cincinnati would feel this duality: a northern city, a southern city. Two cultures, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in a single city. And throughout Cincinnati's history, these warring souls produced constant tension while simultaneously providing Cincinnati with a unique culture and way of life. This duality, this dialectic, this contradiction is central to understanding the history of both Cincinnati and its African American population. Borderland culture, where North meets South, then creates, in part, the setting and background, or backdrop, to the African American experience in Cincinnati. In this city, blacks lived on the edge, the margin, as they never could in Philadelphia, Buffalo, Detroit, Chicago, or even Cleveland. At the same time, because black Cincinnatians lived in the northern borderland, they lived on the edge, the margin, as they never could in Louisville, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., or even St. Louis. Although Cincinnati was a city with a northern-southern personality, Ohio still was not Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, or South Carolina. And Cincinnati was not Richmond, New Orleans, or Charleston. Both before and after the Civil War, the political rights of blacks in the South, and in a certain sense those of their white allies, were severely circumscribed. This did not happen in Cincinnati. After the Civil War, blacks faced the future with great optimism. The legal foundation of racism was dismantled. The black laws, including the state separate school law, were all repealed by 1887. By contrast, during the same period, Jim Crow and white supremacy were written into the Southern law of the land. Law became the foundation upon which racism was based in the South. Nevertheless, the postbellum dreams of African Americans were deferred. Although discriminatory laws were lacking, public opinion, prejudices, and social customs still hindered blacks' quest for equality and successful integration into white dominant society. The hiring and promotional practices of white employers and the racist attitudes of white workers combined to keep blacks at the bottom of the occupational ladder. As the old walking city crumbled, the evolving land use system based on housing cost and type, and buttressed by white hostility to the idea of having black neighbors, led to ghetto slum formation. Still, prejudice and discrimination notwithstanding, the color caste system did not rest on a legal foundation. The naked terror was not systematically employed to keep blacks in their place. In Cincinnati, blacks could speak out and meet openly. They could petition and protest. After securing the right to vote in 1870, they never experienced the horror and tragedy of disenfranchisement. Yet, by living on Dixie's border, African Americans were not allowed to forget the proscription hampering Southern blacks. Life on the edge constantly reminded them of their marginal position in white-dominated society. This, combined with their relative freedom, caused black Cincinnatians to develop a tradition of aggressiveness and political activism that differed significantly from that of African Americans living just across the Ohio River in the southern borderland and in the Deep South. So a history of the black experience in Cincinnati is particularly important because it sheds light on black urban history in the borderland, that northern place situated betwixt and between the North and South. The history of African Americans in Cincinnati is also tied to the development of the city building process, and the theoretical constructs, definitions, and policy formulations of those urban leaders who shaped the physical environment and determined in part where blacks lived within that environment. This book spans a period of about 140 years. During this time, Cincinnati underwent dramatic changes as it passed through several distinct epochs. The commercial, industrializing, industrial, and post-industrial eras.
Epochs.
Over this broad span of time, the city's population grew from less than 100,000 to over 500,000. Its territorial boundaries expanded from 6 square miles to more than 70 square miles. Its internal organization changed from a pattern of overlapping land use to one of segregated land use. Its method of electing representatives changed from a ward-based system to a complex 9x limited voting system. And its economy shifted from commerce to industry, then to service and high technology. In each stage of its development, Cincinnati was characterized by a specific type of economic base: transportation system, structure, the spatial organization of key functional areas and essential services, facilities in response to certain fundamental living needs and activities of human society, and form, the visual perceptive features of the city which this structure produces, both the two-dimensional and three-dimensional forms created by surface space structures and circulatory systems in a defined natural setting, which shaped the everyday life and culture of its people. As Cincinnati moved through time, changes in its economy and transportation system had a profound impact on its structure and form, as well as a profound effect on the behavior and life chances of its people. The events of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are suggestive. During this period, Cincinnati made the transition from a commercial to a modern industrial city. Not only did the physical boundaries of the city expand to include many surrounding towns and villages, but its internal organization, structure, and form shifted fundamentally. These physical changes shattered the narrow perimeters of the old walking city and scattered people and industry across the urban hinterland. The changes taking place in Cincinnati affected the everyday life and culture of African Americans. At each of these stages in Cincinnati's development, African Americans faced a different set of problems, opportunities, and challenges as the city moved from the commercial to the industrializing, to the industrial, and into the post-industrial age. So the realities and possibilities facing blacks were constantly changing. For example, the type of jobs and opportunities available to blacks in 1850 were very different from those available in both 1890 and 1950. The location of the black community changed from epoch to epoch as well. In the commercial city, most blacks lived in the East End. By the turn of the century, they were concentrated in the West End. And by 1960, the black population center had shifted to the hilltop neighborhood of Avondale. Even racism changed over time. In the antebellum era, blacks faced black laws, race riots, and open hostility from whites. After the Civil War, the laws were repealed and legally sanctioned racism stopped. But popular culture, social customs, and public opinion promoted segregation and fueled prejudice and discrimination. The discriminatory hiring and promotional practices of white employers, the prejudicial behavior of white workers, and the restrictive covenants, zoning laws, building codes, and subdivision regulations replaced the black laws as the primary vehicles of black oppression or repression. After World War II and the high tide of the civil rights movement, Most manifestations of socially sanctioned racism disappeared, and institutional racism gained dominance. For example, between 1950 and 1970, residential segregation dropped in Cincinnati, and the places of public accommodation opened to people regardless of skin color. Employers stopped the practice of openly rejecting job applicants solely on the basis of race. But the second black ghetto slum appeared. The job ceiling still kept African Americans tied to the bottom of the economic ladder. And although the black population increased dramatically after 1950, Cincinnati's limited voting system kept black political representation at a minimum. Finally, the anger and frustration of blacks exploded with the riot of 1967. As the city changed over time, a host of social groups, including workers, women, physicians, politicians, builders, architects, real estate dealers, developers, industrialists, and businessmen, struggled for the triumph of their vision of the new Cincinnati and to secure for themselves a prominent place in the new social order. In the ensuing search for order, middle-class whites and blacks imposed their notion of order onto the rest of society. It was their definitions of good government and city beautiful, quote unquote, and city practical, quote unquote, of good housing and residential development, and of the place of various groups in the social order that guided the city building process and that defined the context within which the African American experience evolved. The reform movement elevated Cincinnati to national prominence as a model of efficient government and a pioneer in the city planning and housing reform movement. Most significant, the reformers' notions about city building provided the broad framework within which Cincinnati evolved throughout the 20th century. The emergence of Cincinnati as an exemplary, efficient city and as a leader in city planning and housing reform provides yet another reason why the study of Black Cincinnati is so important. Simply put, how did African Americans fare in this well-run city with a model approach to planning and housing reform? Did good government and innovative approaches to residential development make life better for Black Cincinnatians? Thus, the essays in this book locate the Black experience within the context of the city building process. They illuminate that experience at specific moments in Cincinnati's history, as well as across time. Conceptually, then, the focus is on city building and how the changing urban environment and the decisions, definitions, and policy formulations of urban leaders affected the life chances of African Americans and their fight for equality and social justice. In this sense, the collection grapples with both the external and internal forces that shaped the Black experience as Cincinnati moved through successive stages of economic, social, and political development. So at one level, the analytical focus is on the role played by city building and urban leaders in creating the urban environments in which the Black experience unfolded. At another, it is on the response of African Americans to the city building process and to the changing conditions produced by the city as it moved through time. Here, the concern is with how African Americans organized their residential environment and built communities and how they fought against racism. By looking at Black Cincinnati from an urban history perspective, and by focusing on the themes of work, housing, community, and the struggle for advancement, hopefully this volume will offer insight into the critical linkages that bind together the past and the present and create perspective for the future. So that is the preface to the book Race and the City, edited by Henry Louis, let me find it here, Henry Louis Taylor Jr. This is the Greater Cincinnati Bicentennial History Series. And my interest is in it, particularly the reason that I looked for this book is because of the gentrification that is taking place in the community where I live currently, Evanston. I am working with a group called Design for America out of the University of Cincinnati's DAAP department, and hopefully we will be able to pull together data and information to help us as we move through this gentrification process. I'm also working on the Evanston 10-year plan, the housing team, the housing work team, and I have learned quite a bit through that work, but there is so very much more that I need to learn, and I'm reaching out to anybody and everybody who may be able to provide me with more information. So thank you so very much for listening. Do get back with me and let me know if you want me to continue reading this book to you. Next is the introduction, Race in the City, 1820 through 1970. And I believe that the work stops at 1970. I'm not sure. But get back with me and let me know if you're interested in my continuing reading to you. I plan to read it, but if you want me to read it to you, you've got to let me know. All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.